Welcome to the deep dive. Ever just, look up at the night sky or even think about something incredibly complex like a single cell and just wonder, why? Why is all this stuff here?
Yeah, is there like an intelligence behind it all?
Yeah.
Or is it just, well, incredibly intricate chance?
Exactly those kinds of questions. And today, we're really digging into a pile of material articles, notes, research that explores exactly this.
It looks at this almost paradoxical situation modern science is in when it bumps up against these questions of ultimate purpose.
Right, and it contrasts that with a really specific philosophical and theological perspective, drawing from Baha'i wisdom.
So our mission today really is to unpack these particular sources. What are they saying about that tension, between what science can measure and what it seems silent on?
And what is this alternative view they present? The one aiming to kind of bridge that gap between science and spirit. We want to get to the heart of these ideas, not just skim the surface.
Okay, so the sources really kick off by emphasizing the sheer power of science today. I mean, it's undeniable.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about it. We measure galaxies billions of light years away. We can probe the quantum realm, which is just bizarre. And get this, we know our solar system is hurtling through space at something like 796,000 kilometers per hour.
Wow. That number is just staggering.
It is. And it shows this incredible knowledge of how things work, down to the finest details.
But, and here's the tension the sources highlight right away, despite knowing so much about the mechanics, the intricate details, the mathematical precision, science often seems, well, silent on the ultimate purpose, the why behind it all.
That's the core of it. You ask a scientist, strictly within that empirical box, is there a purpose? Is there intelligence? And the honest scientific answer, based purely on the data we can gather now, is usually we don't see evidence for that.
Or even our tools aren't really designed to look for it.
Exactly. And the critique presented in these materials is that this silence might not just be an objective finding about reality itself. It could reflect a kind of built-in philosophical assumption.
Bias.
Yeah, specifically materialism. The idea that only physical stuff, things you can touch and measure, is what's fundamentally real or important.
Right. So science might be operating within this framework that, by definition, kind of excludes questions about non-material purpose.
That's the argument the sources make. And they pose this fundamental challenge. Look at how intricate the universe is, how it sustains itself, how mathematically elegant it seems to be. Is it really plausible that all of this just popped out of undirected randomness?
It's a big question. So if that's the view, a potentially purposeless universe, at least from a purely materialist standpoint, the sources then shift focus. They ask, okay, what's the effect on us? What's the human cost of seeing the universe that way?
Yeah, it moves from the cosmic scale right down to human consciousness. The materials talk about this potential for a crisis of meaning.
What happens when people internalize the idea that maybe there's no grand purpose?
Well, it connects deeply with psychology, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The sources bring in thinkers like Viktor Frankl, who wrote about finding meaning even in the absolute worst circumstances.
Right, in concentration camps.
Exactly. And Carl Jung exploring our deep psychological need for meaning, they suggest we're practically hardwired for it. So if our worldview doesn't provide that,
It can lead to problems.
the sources argue yes, potentially contributing to things like existential despair. And they link this to very real issues we see today, rising depression rates, addiction, even suicide.
It makes you think of that famous line from Nietzsche, God is dead. The sources kind of reflect on that, suggesting maybe what followed wasn't total liberation, but a drift towards nihilism.
The sense that nothing ultimately matters.
Yeah. And you can sort of see that struggle playing out in culture sometimes, swinging between maybe superficial pleasure-seeking and a kind of deep cynicism.
And it's not just individual psychology. The sources bring in a sociological angle, too, mentioning thinkers like Weber and Durkheim.
How does that fit in?
Well, the idea is that modernity, with its focus on reason and technology, promised freedom and progress, but maybe it also led to what Weber called disenchantment, stripping away older sources of meaning found in tradition or religion.
So technology races ahead, we can do amazing things, but maybe something essential gets lost. The sources have that stark phrase, our souls starve.
That really lands, doesn't it? And they give a very current example, social media.
Ah, yes.
We're connected to billions instantly, more connected than ever before, technically. Yet studies keep showing loneliness is actually increasing.
It's a paradox.
It is. And the sources suggest is because that digital connection often lacks real spiritual substance. It doesn't feed that deeper human need for purpose and genuine belonging.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Science's power and its potential silence on purpose, the human need for meaning, and the possible costs of a purely materialist view. Where do the sources go from here?
They introduce this different framework, rooted in the Baha'i faith. And they frame it not just as another religion, but as a radical reinterpretation, maybe a third way that tries to navigate between rigid dogma and reductive materialism.
Interesting, a third way. So what are the key ideas in this framework, according to the sources we have? Let's break it down. Point one seems to be about creation itself.
Yes. And it challenges some very common assumptions. The core idea presented is that creation of the universe doesn't have a beginning point in time, nor does it have an end point. It's seen as fundamentally eternal.
The sources quote directly here. Baha'u'llah says, "The universe hath neither beginning nor ending."
And there's another quote from Abdul-Baha. The world of existence is an emanation of the divine reality. It has always existed and will always exist.
Okay, that word emanation feels important. What does that imply?
It implies something different from creation ex nihilo, out of nothing, at a single moment. It suggests a continuous, ongoing unfolding from this divine reality. It's not a one-time event.
So always existing, always unfolding.
That's the picture painted. And the sources find this interesting because while it's distinct, it resonates perhaps more easily with some modern cosmological ideas like oscillating universes or even multiverse theories than a single linear creation event. But it strongly rejects the materialist idea of pure randomness, too.
Okay, so an eternal unfolding creation. Point two in the sources deals with the nature of that divine reality God. What do they say about that?
This is absolutely central. The concept is that God, in his actual essence, is completely beyond human comprehension, utterly transcendent. We can't grasp or define that ultimate reality.
Again, there's some powerful quotes used, Baha'u'llah. So perfect and comprehensive is his creation that no mind nor heart, however keen or pure, can ever grasp the nature of the most insignificant of his creatures, let alone the creator.
And Abdu'l-Baha is very direct. That which we imagine is not the reality of God. He, the unknowable, is far beyond our imaginings.
What are the implications of that?
Well, it moves away from thinking about God in very human-like terms, anthropomorphized images, which can sometimes feel incompatible with the sheer scale and impersonality suggested by cosmology.
Right, trying to fit an infinite reality into finite human concepts.
Exactly. Instead, the sources suggest we know God through his creation. To use this beautiful analogy, you know the master artist exists because you see the masterpiece, the art itself. But the art can never fully comprehend the inner nature of the artist.
The creation reflects the creator, but doesn't contain or define him.
Precisely. The existence is proven by the work, but the essence remains unknowable.
That leads us logically to the third major point the sources cover.
Wow.
What then is the purpose of this eternal creation, and specifically, what's our purpose within it?
And this is where that need for meaning we talked about earlier is directly addressed. The sources outline a kind of dual purpose for humanity.
Okay, what are they?
One is personal, inward-looking, to know and to love God, to develop that spiritual connection. The other is collective, outward-looking, to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization.
And again, they ground this in quotes from Baha'u'llah. All men have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization, and also, the purpose of God in creating man hath been and will ever be to enable him to know his Creator and to attain his presence.
What's really striking here, I think, is how dynamic this purpose is presented. It's not about achieving some static state or just passing a test. It's about ongoing, continuous spiritual and material progress.
So the two go hand in hand, advancing civilization and knowing God.
That's the idea. And the sources argue this is key to reconciling science and faith. The universe isn't just a random fluke, nor is it just a backdrop for a single divine play. It's more like a vast, eternal school or workshop.
For learning and growth.
Exactly, for the perpetual advancement of individuals and society, spiritually and materially.
So if we pull these three main threads together from the sources, an eternal unfolding creation, a transcendent God known through that creation, and this dynamic purpose of spiritual and societal advancement, how does this form a unified picture?
It aims to provide a coherent worldview, one where science and religion aren't fundamentally at odds. There's that quote from Abdu'l-Baha again. If religion opposes science, it is ignorance, not religion.
Implying that true religion and true science should ultimately align because they're both seeking truth about the same reality.
That's the perspective offered. And this idea of creation as an emanation or an ever-unfolding revelation ties into another core Baha'i concept the sources mention.
No.
Progressive revelation.
What's that about?
It's the idea that divine guidance comes to humanity progressively throughout history, through different spiritual educators or manifestations of God, tailored to the needs and capacity of each age.
Like stages in our collective education.
Sort of, yeah. And the sources stress that the particular guidance needed for our time, for this stage of human maturity, centers on principles like unity, the harmony of science and religion, reason, and actively working towards that ever-advancing civilization.
Which brings us back full circle to that initial tension with purely materialist science. How do the sources conclude this discussion?
They revisit that critique. They use that analogy of the mathematician admiring the complex equation.
But denying the mathematician existed.
Right. Science is brilliant at describing the what and how. The sources acknowledge that fully. But they argue it can leave a void when it comes to the why, the purpose.
And the argument isn't to throw science out, obviously.
Not at all. It's presented as needing to transcend the philosophical limitations that the sources see in strict materialism. It's about offering a bigger picture.
So the final vision presented in these materials is what? Can we summarize it?
I think the core takeaway is this. The universe is presented not as random or temporary, but as eternal, purposeful, and divinely ordered. God isn't a human projection, but an infinite, essentially unknowable reality whose attributes are reflected in creation.
And our role, humanity's place.
It's active and deeply meaningful to strive to reflect those divine attributes like love, justice, knowledge, compassion in our own lives, and crucially, in the structures of society as we collectively build that ever-advancing civilization.
It's quite a vision. The sources position it as something that, especially in a world maybe drowning in data but starved of wisdom, can speak to both the rational mind and the yearning soul.
Trying to provide that sense of overarching purpose and meaning that, as discussed earlier, seems vital for human flourishing.
Well, that really brings us to the end of this particular deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground exploring these sources on science, purpose, meaning, and this specific Baha'i framework.
It definitely touches on some of the most profound questions we can ask about reality
Here.
and our place within it.
Absolutely. So, as you continue thinking about all this, here's a final thought to perhaps mull over, building on what we've discussed from these sources. Given this perspective of an eternal, purposeful cosmos, an unfolding emanation, how might that resonate or maybe clash with some modern scientific concepts you might have heard about? Things like quantum entanglement, suggesting deep interconnectedness, or even theories about multiverses.
Yeah, what new questions does considering this kind of framework raise for you about the fundamental nature of reality and maybe your own part in that unfolding story?